Lilo and Stitch is a deeply sincere film about a lonely girl, a destructive alien experiment, and the radical idea that family doesn't have to look the way we're told it should. It's a story about outsiders, found connection, and how difference can be a kind of strength. And yet, when it came time to market this film, Disney leaned on something very familiar: its own legacy.
For over 70 years, the Walt Disney Studios has won the hearts of audiences with the most enchanting, delightful, and lovable characters the world has ever known. The tradition.
The promotional campaign for Lilo and Stitch wasn't just charming, it was self-aware, strategic, and fundamentally nostalgic. Before audiences met Lilo or heard the word Ohana, they met Stitch, who was quite literally crashing the Disney canon. A series of teaser trailers saw him interrupting iconic moments from The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. This was a bold marketing move, and it was also a very deeply calculated one. At a time when Disney Animation was struggling to maintain its place at the top of the animated food chain, these teasers were a reminder. We're still Disney, you still love us, and look, even our new guy wants in on the classics. This is the story of how Lilo and Stitch used nostalgia not as a safety net, but as a slingshot. How it played with the audience's memory to sell something new. Why Disney felt the need to play on nostalgia at that time, and how, over 20 years later, it contrasts with the way nostalgia is used now. This isn't just about one film. It's about how legacy, marketing, and memory shape the way we experience pop culture. Because where Lilo and Stitch invited audiences to playfully revisit the past, much of Disney's modern era seems content to commodify it. Let's talk about Stitch, let's talk about nostalgia, and let's talk about what happens when a brand remembers its history but still chooses to do something weird with it. To understand why Lilo and Stitch's nostalgia play hits so effectively, we need to back up a bit. Specifically to the mid-1980s, a time when Disney Animation was, to put it gently, circling the drain. It's worth asking, how did Disney get to this point? A large part of it can be traced back to the death of Walt Disney himself in 1966. In the decades that followed, Disney Animation struggled to find its identity. The studio released films like The Aristocats, Robin Hood, The Rescuers, and The Fox and the Hound. All having their own charm and staying power, sure, but none that pushed the boundaries of the art form in the way Walt had done. Technological innovation slowed, and narrative ambition was limited. While the studio had successes, the hunger that had defined Walt's vision, this sense of animation as an evolving, boundary-breaking medium, began to dim. By the time The Black Cauldron hit theatres in 1985, the writing was on the wall. The animation was uneven, the tone was too grim, and the budget had ballooned. It failed on nearly every front. Disney effectively disowned the film, and it wasn't released on home video until 1998 as a show of their bad faith. Quietly brushed aside, The Black Cauldron became a cautionary tale for what happened when the studio lost sight of its strengths. So with all of that said, it was time for a rebrand and a creative overhaul. It's easy to give credit to executives like Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, who were brought in to revive the studio, with Eisner as CEO and Katzenberg overseeing Walt Disney feature animation. But the real magic came from the artists. People like directors Ron Clements and John Musker, composer Alan Menken, and lyricist Howard Ashman. They didn't just make hits. They brought Broadway structure to animation, turning songs into storytelling engines and character arcs into showstoppers. Their contributions weren't just creative, they were foundational to rebuilding Disney's storytelling ethos after a period of corporate uncertainty and creative stagnation.
It's a place, it's usually about the third song of the evening. Sometimes it's the second, sometimes it's the fourth, but it's quite early. And the leading lady usually sits down on something. Sometimes it's a tree stump in Brigadoon, sometimes it's under the pillars of Covent Garden in My Fair Lady, or it's a trash can in Little Shop of Horrors. But the leading lady sits down on something and sings about what she wants in life. And the audience falls in love with her and then roots for her to get it for the rest of the night.
What followed was an unprecedented run. The Little Mermaid in 1989, Beauty and the Beast in 1991, Aladdin in 1992, and The Lion King in 1994. Collectively, Disney's animated films of the 1990s are known as the Disney Renaissance. These films revived the company's reputation, made lots of money, won awards, and raised a generation. I mean, hell, Beauty and the Beast even made history as the first animated film ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, breaking barriers and redefining what animated storytelling could achieve in the eyes of both audiences and critics. If you were born in the late 80s or early 90s, these weren't just films. They were cultural milestones that set the gold standard for family entertainment. But like all golden eras, the Renaissance eventually began to tarnish. If Disney animation in the second half of the 1990s can be defined by anything, it's tonal inconsistency.
Silence!
Justice!
I'm losing to a bird!
Meg! No!
Oh, I got a fur wedgie.
One.
Dishonor on you? Dishonor on your cow?
By the time Pocahontas debuted in 1995, audiences were starting to feel the formula. The lush visuals, Broadway-style ballads, and earnest moral lessons were beginning to blur together. Pocahontas had lofty ambitions. It aimed to blend historical gravitas with Disney's tried-and-true romantic fantasy structure. But the attempt to graft complex colonial themes onto a conventional Romeo and Juliet-style love story left the film with a tone problem.
Murderous thieves, there's no room for their kind in civilized society.
My bark is worse than my bite.
While the film was visually beautiful and musically rich, it lacked the narrative clarity and emotional depth of its predecessors. Then came 1996's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, arguably one of Disney's most artistically daring efforts of the period. Adapted from Victor Hugo's dark, tragic novel, the film wrestled with themes of lust, religious hypocrisy, and social cruelty. And yet, it was still a family musical. The result was tonally conflicted. Critics praised its ambition and Alan Menken's soaring score, which arguably is the very best that he ever made for the studio, but audiences were uncertain about how to emotionally engage with a film that featured both slapstick gargoyle sidekicks and a villain literally singing about hellfire. Let's look at some examples of this disparate tone.
All right. Pour the wine and cut the cheese.
A abomination.
Achilles, sit.
Whoa! My last captain of the guard was a bit of a disappointment to me.
Look at that disgusting display.
Yes, sir. A lesson needs to be learned here.
I'm losing to a bird!
The 1997 release of Hercules marked a tonal whiplash in the opposite direction. After two heavy, prestige-minded releases, this was Disney's attempt at a breezy, irreverent take on mythology. Inspired by Saturday morning cartoons and gospel choirs, it leaned hard into humour and pop culture references. And while Hercules works as an animated comedy, it didn't always gel with the elements of Greek mythology that necessitated a more serious tone. It's less of a glaring tonal inconsistency and more of a tonal confusion. 1998's Mulan, on the other hand, was something of a return to form. The film offered a compelling protagonist, memorable music, and a strong feminist message, but it too didn't spark the kind of cultural wildfire seen earlier in the decade. Then came Tarzan in 1999, the last film commonly considered part of the Disney Renaissance. Phil Collins' soundtrack gave it a contemporary, chart-friendly edge, and the film was praised for its kinetic action sequences and technical achievements, particularly in its use of a technique called deep canvas. But again, it felt like a refinement of the formula, not a reinvention. These films weren't failures. They made money, earned awards, and developed loyal fan bases, but the era of consistent, culture-defining dominance was slipping.
I'm losing to a bird!
The artistic innovation was still present, but the cohesion, the sense that Disney was reshaping the cultural conversation with each release, was beginning to fade. The Renaissance formula, once electric, was starting to feel like a template. Then came the new millennium, and with it an identity crisis for Disney animation. The creative leadership at the time found themselves trying to steady a ship that was starting to drift. Fantasia 2000 was an ambitious sequel to Walt's original 1940 experiment, pitched as a celebration of classical music and animation. While technically dazzling and occasionally beautiful, it struggled to find a modern audience. The appeal of orchestral animation vignettes, especially with no unifying narrative, felt niche in an era increasingly defined by character-driven storytelling. 2000's Dinosaur, though financially successful, was also a mixed bag. It was Disney's first full-length film to blend live-action backgrounds with CGI characters. a huge technical milestone for the company at the time, but it lacked the narrative depth or emotional connection audiences expected. The film's then cutting-edge look couldn't compensate for its thin plot and generic characters, and despite its earnings, it left very little cultural footprint. Besides Zinni, of course.
What you need is a little help from the love monkey.
Then there was 2000's The Emperor's New Groove. Originally conceived as a sprawling epic titled Kingdom of the Sun, complete with original songs by Sting and a dramatic Prince and the Pauper-esque plotline. The production famously fell apart and was completely overhauled. What emerged was a buddy comedy with a drastically different tone. Irreverent, fast-paced, and deeply self-aware. It flopped in cinemas, relatively speaking, but found unexpected longevity on home video. And then a behind-the-scenes documentary directed by Sting's wife Trudy Styler has intrigued fans of the film since its release. The documentary does not depict Disney in a positive light. It shows Sting's songs being cast aside as the film's production was overhauled. Disney buried the documentary, but there are work print versions available online. Then 2001's Atlantis: The Lost Empire continued the studio's experimentation. It abandoned musical numbers, cast a grittier tone, and leaned heavily into science fiction and world building. But that ambition came at a cost. The film struggled to connect with audiences, partly because its marketing couldn't quite explain what it was. Was it an action-adventure? Was it a steampunk fable? Was it a kid's Indiana Jones? Its box office underperformance and lack of clear identity made it another mark in a growing list of near misses.
Lettuce! Lettuce!
What had once felt like an unstoppable creative streak was now sputtering, both creatively and commercially. Disney was no longer the automatic leader in animation. That crown was beginning to slip, with rising competition from up-and-coming studios like Pixar, DreamWorks, and Blue Sky. Disney's signature magic wasn't gone, but it was no longer effortless. Note that when the Academy Awards introduced the Best Animated Feature category in 2001, not only did Disney lose the award, they weren't even nominated. The studio needed a reset, something unexpected but sincere. A film that could move merchandise but also move audiences. Something that reminded us of the Disney we loved without repeating it beat for beat. They found it in A Strange Little Alien and A Lonely Girl in Hawaii. So, by 2002, Disney needed a revival, and it didn't come from a princess or a Broadway-style ballad. It came from a genetically engineered alien with the voice of a broken fax machine and the energy of a toddler drinking espresso. Stitch wasn't just a new character, he was a brand disruptor. And rather than shy away from that, Disney's marketing team made it the entire pitch. Lilo and Stitch was a tonal outlier. No castles, no epic prophecies, just a scrappy, emotionally raw story about a grieving family and a dog-shaped alien weapon. It read more like an indie dramedy with space lasers than a tentpole animated blockbuster. And yet it was Disney's tentpole summer release of 2002. You know, the country bears notwithstanding.
Oh, that's no little bear! That's my brother!
This all posed an interesting problem. How does Disney market a film that breaks the conventional formula to an audience that only trusts that formula? Well, the answer was simple. They did as the Greeks and made it a Trojan horse.
For the Trojans, hey, they bet on the wrong horse, okay?
The teaser campaign positioned Stitch not as an heir to the Disney legacy, but as an intruder. And the way they did that was by having him crash iconic scenes from 4 of Disney's most iconic films. In The Little Mermaid, Ariel is in full Disney princess mode, perched dramatically on her seaside rock as waves crash behind her. But instead of an emotional crescendo, we get Stitch surfing the wave that swallows her moment. Ariel, understandably irritated, throws a starfish at him before diving back into the ocean.
I was singing here.
In Beauty and the Beast, Belle and Beast waltz beneath the iconic ballroom chandelier. Enter Stitch, clambering across the ceiling before swinging from the chandelier, which promptly crashes to the floor. Belle storms off with an eye roll and a deadpan,
Get your own movie.
In Aladdin, Jasmine and Aladdin float peacefully through the night sky during the A Whole New World sequence. Then Stitch pulls up in his spaceship, honks the horn, flirts shamelessly with Jasmine, and flies off with her, leaving Aladdin stunned and muttering,
Hey! You get your own movie.
And in The Lion King, Rafiki holds Stitch up instead of Simba. Timon below protests,
Hey, that's not Simba.
Rafiki, startled, drops Stitch. Chaos ensues. Stitch climbs up to the top of Pride Rock, clears his throat, and belts out his best parody roar. The teasers followed the same mischievous blueprint. First, establish a beloved moment. A Disney Renaissance-era icon, a signature shot, something unmistakably classic. Then, halfway through, let Stitch ruin it. He wasn't just being introduced into the Disney universe, he was interrupting it, hijacking it, claiming it as his own. He throws Ariel off her rock, he drops a chandelier on Belle, he steals Jasmine from Aladdin, he gets held up instead of Simba and causes a stampede. These were deliberate mini-home invasions, and they did more than make audiences laugh. They told them exactly what kind of character Stitch was. Chaotic, disruptive, gleefully irreverent, and absolutely not business as usual. And Disney were totally in on the joke. That kind of self-parody, letting a new character trash your most sacred IP, would have been unthinkable in the Golden Age. But here it worked because the studio trusted its audience to get the gag. It was clever, it was meta, and it turned the marketing into a story in itself. Disney didn't feel the need to hold the audience's hand, they just expected the audience to keep up. And if you didn't, well...
Here, educate yourself!
Even the poster leaned into the outsider narrative, and did so with remarkable restraint. Stitch sits dead center, surrounded by a ring of scowling Disney icons. No swirling magical backdrops, no overloaded cast montage, no glittering palace in the distance. Just white space, Stitch, and a halo of disapproval. Compared to the maximalist posters from the 90s Renaissance era, packed with characters, settings, sidekicks, and a tagline, this one was minimal, cheeky, subversive. It didn't sell the plot, the world, or even Lilo. It sold Stitch's attitude, and in doing so it planted a flag. This isn't another fairy tale, and you're going to love it. Meanwhile, the usual marketing touchstones that we've grown to expect from a Disney tentpole release were still there. Happy Meal toys, plushies, soundtrack tie-ins. But none of it felt boilerplate. Every element was twisted through Stitch's chaotic, unpredictable energy. The merchandise was wild, colourful, and leaned into his slapstick appeal, making him irresistible to kids. The Elvis-heavy soundtrack was as much a quirky joke as it was a clever demographic play. For kids, it added absurdity and novelty. For parents, it was a nostalgic hook. Both Lilo and Stitch's love of Elvis in the film doubled as character traits and a strategic marketing crossover, one that expanded the film's reach across generations and gave it pop cultural weight beyond typical animated fare. And Disney even snuck in some emotional levity, reusing a piece from James Newton Howard's Dinosaur score, originally composed for one of that film's more awe-filled, visually grand moments.
For over 70 years, the Walt Disney Studios has won the hearts of audiences with the most enchanting, delightful, and lovable.
The music lent a sense of scale and emotional gravity to trailers that were otherwise comedic and chaotic, bridging the gap between Disney's legacy of spectacle and this new, more emotionally grounded story. What was the result of all of this? Well, it was a campaign that felt like it had teeth. It knew it was weird, and it leaned into that. Most importantly, the Stitch you saw in the marketing, that messy, lovable menace, was the Stitch you met on screen. That kind of narrative alignment between campaign and character isn't just effective marketing, it's branding with a point of view. Nostalgia is one of those tools that can either feel like magic or manipulation. Done right, it taps into something equivalent to emotional muscle memory, like a little jolt you get when something feels familiar, even if you haven't seen it in years. But when it's overplayed, when it's just reheating the past for the sake of comfort, that's when audiences start to tune out. The Lilo and Stitch marketing team understood that, and instead of using nostalgia as a crutch, they used it like a wink. The teasers didn't beg us to rewatch the classics out of duty, they playfully messed with them. It wasn't, remember how great this was, it was, hey, remember this, let's mess it up a bit. That kind of cheeky tone only works when you trust your audience to get the joke, and more importantly, to laugh with you. Because this wasn't reverent, and it wasn't syrupy. It was irreverent in the best way. Stitch wasn't being positioned as the next heir to the Disney throne. He wasn't another noble hero or charming rogue. He was the chaos crashing the party, and somehow that made him feel even more real. Like we already knew him. And look, nostalgia can be tricky. When it's treated like sacred text, it stops being fun. It becomes precious, fragile, untouchable. That's not what Lilo and Stitch did. These teasers gave audiences the freedom to poke fun at the stories they loved, and maybe even let go of the idea that Disney had to look a certain way. More than anything, those teaser trailers gave Stitch a voice. They told us who he was before we knew his name. Not with backstory or exposition, but with pure vibes. He was scrappy. He was unpredictable. He was the gremlin in Disney's well-oiled machine. And by dropping him into those pristine, iconic scenes, the campaign asked a brilliant question. What happens when you introduce chaos to perfection? And surprisingly, the answer wasn't destruction. It was something kind of heartfelt. Because this wasn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It was nostalgia used to make space for something new. It's why those teasers still hold up. They were more than just callbacks, like cinematic handshake deals between the old and the new. And they worked, because they said, yeah, we know what you love, we love it too, but come and look at what's up next. For all the cleverness in the campaign, none of it would have mattered if Lilo and Stitch hadn't delivered. Marketing can't carry a film without a film worth carrying. And Lilo and Stitch, despite being marketed like a prankster cousin to the Disney Renaissance, hit with heart. The film earned over $273 million globally on a $80 million budget. Not exactly record-breaking, but a clear financial success at a time when Disney desperately needed one. It was also nominated for the Oscar for Best Animated Feature, ultimately losing to Spirited Away, which, to be fair, was probably the correct outcome. More importantly, Lilo and Stitch broke through culturally. It wasn't just watched, it was rewatched, quoted, merchandised, and adopted as shorthand for emotional resilience. The film also spawned a successful Disney Channel TV series, and several direct-to-video sequels, cementing its place as one of the rare early 2000s Disney properties to truly extend beyond its original release. The marketing campaign undeniably played a role in that success. The nostalgic teasers got people through the door, but the film's emotional sincerity kept them there. In a market increasingly dominated by spectacle, Lilo and Stitch was small, weird, and rooted in human feeling. Its animation was more rounded and more textured, with watercolour backgrounds that felt warmer and more handcrafted than Disney's more modern, polished aesthetic. The decision to use watercolour backgrounds was a visual throwback to the earliest Disney animated features, which also used watercolour to evoke a sense of storybook charm and artistry. It didn't try to be epic, it tried to be honest. And that honesty, that deeply felt exploration of loneliness, grief, and chosen family, gave it a staying power that outlasted many of its flashier contemporaries. That contrast between a marketing campaign built on loud, recognisable nostalgia and a film rooted in soft, original emotion shouldn't have worked. But it did. Because it turned out the audience wanted both. They wanted to be reminded of what they loved, and then offered a reason to love something new. In the years following Lilo and Stitch, Disney discovered that nostalgia was more than just a marketing tool. It was actually a fully fledged business model. The studio had always reissued classic titles from the Disney Vault, a system which limited the availability of their animated films for home release to create artificial scarcity and maintain demand. But the 2010s saw a more aggressive strategy take hold. If people loved the animated originals, why not remake them in live action? Of course, the idea wasn't brand new. Disney had dipped into live-action retellings before, with 1994's The Jungle Book and the 101 Dalmatians duology in 1996 and 2000.
I've no use for babies.
But those were outliers. Novelties, really. It wasn't until the billion-dollar successes of 2010's Alice in Wonderland and 2015's Cinderella that the model solidified. Suddenly, the studio's roadmap was clear. Every major animated film would eventually get a glossy, high-budget remake.
Let's get ready for Dumbo!
From The Jungle Book and Beauty and the Beast to The Lion King and Mulan, Disney leaned hard into nostalgia, but this time with a different tone. These remakes didn't wink at the past the way Lilo and Stitch did. They revered it, often to the point of creative paralysis. Scenes were replicated shot for shot. Songs were re-recorded with minimal reinterpretation and oftentimes with depressingly less theatricality. And when changes were made, they often came under scrutiny for either erasing what fans loved or failing to justify the update. Just take a look at Belle's washing machine in 2017's Beauty and the Beast. A new subplot added that showcases Belle's mad inventing skills that are mentioned all of one time because the townspeople smash her washing machine. Why? For teaching another girl to read.
What on earth are you doing? Teaching another girl to read? Isn't one enough?
Yikes. What was once a playful nod to Disney's legacy began to feel more like brand maintenance. These weren't stories being retold because someone had a new angle. They were being reissued because the IP had value, and the market had proven willing to pay for familiarity. Which brings us to the Lilo and Stitch live-action remake. Unlike The Lion King or Aladdin, Lilo and Stitch wasn't a musical epic. Its charm came from its sincerity, its scale, and its softness. Translating that into a photoreal or CGI-heavy remake raises questions. Can the messiness of Stitch's design survive the smoothing effects of digital realism? Will the emotional tone hold when rendered through more prestige live-action aesthetics? There's also a deeper discomfort. In chasing live-action versions of its animated legacy, Disney seems to imply that animation is a draft, not a final product. That these stories are worth more when they resemble traditional cinema. It undercuts the artistry of animation. Sadly ironic, given that the studio was built on celebrating exactly that. Where Lilo and Stitch once playfully disrupted Disney's canon, its remake now risks enshrining it. What was once a film that broke the mold may now be reshaped to fit it. In other words, nostalgia once used as a launchpad is now a loop. And loops, while comforting, rarely lead anywhere new. Part of what made Lilo and Stitch so effective was that its nods to Disney's legacy were playful and ironic rather than deferential. The trailers poked fun at the classics rather than worshipping them. The marketing campaign used nostalgia to invite audiences in, but it didn't rely on it to carry the film. But over 20 years later, things feel very different. Nostalgia isn't just a tactic anymore, it's a safety net for risk-averse studios. Every remake leans heavily on recognisable beats, iconic iconography, and familiar music cues. There's less emphasis on why the film is being remade and more focus on what can be preserved. The creative decisions often feel less like storytelling and more like brand management. And really, how could it not? In the age of IP-driven strategy decks and multi-phase rollout slates, nostalgia is the shortcut to guaranteed clicks. But when every new release is a variation on a past success, the emotional punch that nostalgia once carried is diluted. It's not memory being honoured, it's memory being monetized. This over-reliance on the past has dulled its impact. When everything is a reference to something else, the novelty wears off. Legacy sequels, franchise reboots, and live-action remakes have flooded the market, and audiences are increasingly wary of being sold the same story twice. I mean, just take a look at how 2025's Snow White remake performed. Pretty damn badly. So while Lilo and Stitch use nostalgia as a springboard to say something new, its successors too often use it as a crutch. And that shift from wink to worship is where the magic starts to unravel. And then, simultaneously, the Lilo and Stitch remake has also jumped on the nostalgic marketing trend, with posters satirising Disney properties like Marvel and Star Wars, as well as other live-action remakes like Snow White, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, and Moana, which, so help me God, has its own live-action remake releasing in 2026. In hindsight, Lilo and Stitch was more than just a surprise hit. It was like a quiet revolution. At a time when Disney was wading through an identity crisis, the film managed to blend irreverence with sincerity, innovation with homage. And perhaps most impressively, it utilised nostalgia without being beholden to it. It's easy to forget just how out of step Lilo and Stitch was with the animated landscape of the early 2000s. While other animated films chased grandeur or leaned heavily on familiar fantasy tropes, Lilo and Stitch told a small story about grief, belonging, and found family. The marketing played with the classics to get you to the cinema, but the reason you stayed was because it had something entirely new to say. That balance is rare, and based on Disney's recent track record, increasingly difficult to replicate. Because nostalgia isn't inherently bad. When wielded thoughtfully, it can connect generations, rekindle joy, and frame new ideas within familiar shapes. But when it's used cynically or lazily, it flattens stories into products. It transforms curiosity into brand loyalty, and imagination into recognition. So yes, Lilo and Stitch has got a remake. And maybe it'll be good. Maybe it'll capture the chaos and charm of the original. But let's not forget, the magic of the first Lilo and Stitch wasn't just in its story. It was in how it chose to tell it, with heart and with humour, and with a middle finger raised ever so gently to the very machine that produced it. In the end, it wasn't just a film. It was a message that new characters could crash the canon and still belong. That Ohana means nobody gets left behind, even the weird ones. And maybe, just maybe, the past is most powerful when you use it to build something unexpected.